Welcome to the 32nd meeting of the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee. The first item of business is consideration of the following EUSI. That's the Animal Welfare and Invasive Non-Native Species Amendment EU Exit Regulations 2020. Members will recall that there's an agreed protocol between the Scottish Government and the Parliament in relation to instruments being made by the UK Government under powers in the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018, and which relate to proposals within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament. Do any members have any comments on this? Thus, do members agree to approve the Scottish Government's proposal to consent to the provisions being made in the UK Parliament on this UK statutory instrument? I'm seeing that you do. Agree. Thank you. The next item of business is Stage 2, consideration of the withdrawal from the European Union Continuity Scotland Bill. As agreed by the Parliament, this committee will consider amendments to Part 2 of the bill. Amendments to the rest of the bill will be considered by the Finance and Constitution Committee at its meeting tomorrow. The amendments being considered today start at number 1000. You'll be glad to hear there are not 1000 amendments, but there are a lot. That numbering has been used to distinguish the amendments that will be considered by this committee from those that will be considered by the Finance and Constitution Committee. And we will start at section 9 of the bill. Joining the committee is the Cabinet Secretary for Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform, Rosanna Cunningham, and her officials. Welcome to you all. And we will also be joined by Liam MacArthur MSP and Alec Rowley MSP. Welcome to you both. So we've got a lot to get through this morning. We do have provision to meet this afternoon if required, but I'll take a view on the need for this as we progress through the bill. So everyone should have a copy of the bill as introduced, the marshalled list of amendments which set out the amendments in the order in which they will be disposed of and the groupings. And I'll remind members that requests to speak should be made by typing R in the Blue Jeans chat function once I have called the relevant group. So please only speak when I call your name. Only committee members are eligible to vote, and voting will take place using roll call, and I'll call your names alphabetically. Once I've read out the result of the vote, should you consider that your vote has been incorrectly recorded, then please let me know as soon as possible, and I'll pause to provide time for this. I also want to say from the outset that if we have any tied votes on any amendments, I will, as convener, vote as I voted in the original division, and I'll do that consistently throughout the process. If we lose connection to any member or to the Cabinet Secretary, I'll suspend the meeting until we reconnect. In the unlikely event that reconnecting is not possible, we'll need to continue our meeting in the afternoon. And I will suspend for a comfort break at a suitable point this morning. Strongly encourage succinct contributions from all those speaking today, and I now begin Stage 2 proceedings. Right. I call Amendment 1022 in the name of Mark Ruskell, grouped with the amendments as shown in the groupings. I ask Mark Ruskell to move Amendment 1022 and speak to all amendments in the group. Mark.
Thanks very much, convener, and morning everybody. I think this grouping is a good place to start detailed consideration of the Continuity Bill, the aim of which, of course, is to maintain the good progress the UK delivered by working in solidarity with other countries across the EU. Now, none of my amendments in this group are about putting detailed policy goals into law. None are about introducing new, untried and untested concepts into law. They're simply about retaining the way that principles have been applied for many years. These amendments in many ways are quite conservative. They're about preserving the way principles have been and continue to be applied. I would be concerned about unintended consequences if this status quo was changed. 80% of our environmental laws come from the European directives that have a high level of environmental protection, sustainable development and animal sentience integrated into the policy process. And if we had up to now implemented domestic laws in contravention of these directives, they could have been challenged and struck down. So these principles are with us now and should stay with us as we develop new policy in parallel with the EU. Now, Article 37 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights in the European Union says, and I want to read this out, high-level environmental protection and the improvement of the quality of the environment must be integrated into the policies of the Union and ensured in accordance with the principle of sustainable development. And these words are also reflected in the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. So the amendments in this group in my name enshrine these principles into the Continuity Bill because they're about continuing the way we apply the four main environmental principles, so they deliver a high-level environmental protection in an integrated and a sustainable way. During our Stage 1 evidence, we heard from Professor Scotford that the absence of a principle of high-level environmental protection was, in her words, a glaring oversight, particularly as the four main principles can be interpreted in stronger or weaker ways. Setting an explicit commitment to a high-level environmental protection avoids diluting the ambition of the other environmental principles. Now, I welcome Claudia Beamish's amendment, which picks up on the sustainable development aspect to complete the suite of amendments here. And I also welcome her amendment to apply the precautionary principle more broadly to human health and the relevance of that to issues such as air quality. As for my amendments on animal sentience, starting with Amendment 1022, we did reach a consensus during the first Continuity Bill that this principle should be maintained. So it's disappointing to see it not reflected in primary legislation. If the government is considering a very different way of enshrining animal sentience going forward, then I'd like to know broadly what it is considering at this point, when it will be ready, and if it ends up different to the EU definition, then how will we maintain alignment going forward? Convener, I'll leave it there, but I'll look forward to the Cabinet Secretary's comments and comments from fellow committee members.
Thank you. I now call on Stuart Stevenson to speak to Amendment 1053.
Thank you, Convener. In the committee's Stage 1 report, we concluded that an amendment should be brought forward to bring the integration principle into the bill. And in essence, that's the high-level reference that we've just heard Mark Ruskell make. I have 5 amendments that seek to bring the integration principle into the bill. Amendment 1003 from Mark Ruskell is also a necessary adjunct to my 5 amendments. You should be supported if you support my amendments. I had originally tabled an amendment very similar to 105, and it was excluded as being identical. I believe my amendments are effective and work with other provisions. Basically, developing policy becomes more widely drawn as making policy. And my amendment 1055 provides a definition of that to create the principle that I'm seeking to bring in. There are lots of other amendments in this particular group that seek to do other things, which I think go substantially beyond providing continuity from the status quo ante. Now, I'll listen very carefully to the arguments and hear what the Minister and others have to say, but perhaps I think they may have a place elsewhere rather than what is a continuity bill that's relatively focused on some particular issues. Convener, thank you.
Thank you. I now call on Claudia Beamish to speak to Amendment 1054 and other amendments in the group. Claudia.
Thank you very much, Convener. And I'll speak first to that amendment, which amends Section 9 of the bill, so the precautionary principle is included in its entirety, rather than limiting it to how it relates to the environment only. This amendment expands the principle to include human health hazard considerations as well. Members will recall that there was a recommendation of the committee at Stage 1 report, and it was raised by the Faculty of Advocates and a number of others in written evidence. Human health hazards can often be impacted by environmental wrongdoing, and many will be reassured to know that a cautious approach be taken to our health in cases of air pollution, hazardous chemical spills or flaring, to name but a few of the concerns that are often raised with myself and others. As to Amendment 1001A, the amendment is an amendment to Mark Ruskell's Amendment 1001, which adds the principle that ministers must aim at a high level of environmental protection for the environment, which I'm supportive of. My amendment adds a particular reference to promotion of sustainable development. It is important that such a reference be included here in the general principles section of the bill. In the EU's words, sustainable development aims at the continuous improvement of the quality of life on Earth of both current and future generations. Core tenet of the EU and of Scotland, and I therefore disagree courteously with Stuart Stevenson on this point. It is a core tenet in my view, and it is right that sustainable development is front and centre in the guiding principles in the bill focused on keeping pace. This is the case, in my view, even if it is also recognised elsewhere on the face of the bill. I'm also supportive of all Mark Ruskell's amendments in this group, including animal sentience, and I do think it is very important that this is recognised as part of keeping pace. And I will leave it at that. Thank you very much, Convener. Sorry, I'm also supportive of Stuart's amendments. Sorry, my apologies.
Thank you, Claudia. And I call on Liz Smith.
Convener, and I do apologise if there are some IT problems here. I seem to have a bit of a connection problem, but I understand the committee can see me. I just wanted to say that whilst I very much agree with the principles of improving animal welfare and animal sentience, I'm not convinced of Mark Ruskell's amendments in this situation, because I don't think they actually deliver exactly what he is trying to get across. I think there are other opportunities and other areas of legislation where we can do this, so I'm afraid I'm not convinced of that. I'm happy to support Stuart Stevenson's amendments. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, and I call on Liam MacArthur.
Thanks very much, Convener. Like Liz Smith, I think the IT problem. I start with thanking Mark Ruskell for bringing forward his amendments, perhaps congratulate him too on managing to do so ahead of a queue of us looking to do likewise. As I said during the Stage 1 debate, while the principles set out in the government's original bill are fine as far as they go, I don't believe they go far enough. Aiming to deliver a high level of protection for the environment is key, and I think Claudia Beamish's amendment 1001A on promoting sustainable development may helpfully underpin that too. Meanwhile, amendments 1002 and 1003 further ensure that the bill incorporates other relevant Lisbon Treaty principles, and so perhaps maybe do so a little more robustly than Stuart Stevenson's amendment, though if Mark Ruskell isn't successful, I'd certainly be supportive of Stuart's efforts, and look forward to hearing what the Minister has to say. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, and I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. I think it might be helpful to start looking at this large group of amendments by setting out the broad purpose of the environmental principle measures that are actually in this bill. Through the provisions in the bill, we are seeking to ensure a role for domestic environmental principles informed by the 4 EU environmental principles in the development of law and policy in Scotland. And I think there's broad support for continuing the role of the 4 environmental principles as they operate at the EU level. They had the highest level of buy-in when we were originally consulting on this, and that was clear from the responses to the consultation in 2019. It's been clear from the work that we've done subsequently with a whole range of stakeholders. And that's the focus of the principles provisions in the bill. I'm concerned about attempts to amend these provisions to include other measures drawn from the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union that are unrelated to policy and law for the environment. And this would expand the reach of this part without relevant stakeholders having had any meaningful chance to consider and respond. So if we could look at the first amendment under consideration, 1023, which is the first of 10 amendments, 1022, 1023, 1024, 1025, 1026, 1027, 1028, 1030, 1033, 1052 that Mark Ruskell has introduced to seek to extend the guiding principles on the environment to also cover animal welfare. I don't think that sufficient attention has been paid to Section 12 of the bill, which sets out the purpose of the duties as protecting and improving the environment and contributing to sustainable development. Animal welfare is an important subject, but it is not environmental policy. Article 13 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, to which Mark Ruskell refers in his Amendment 1024, does not relate to environmental policies, but rather to the Union's agriculture, fisheries, transport, internal market, research and technological development and space policies. There's a lot of policies listed in that article, but there is conspicuously no mention of the environment. It is inappropriate, I think, to shoehorn this subject, however important, into these guiding principles on the environment. I'm also of the view that such proposals requiring ministers and public bodies to have regard to the welfare requirements of animals as sentient beings in making law and policy would need full consultation, taking into account existing legislation on animal health and welfare. Farming and land management sectors have, at the very least, the right to be consulted before a change of this nature is introduced into Scottish legislation. Animal sentience has been implicitly recognised in Scottish legislation for over a century, most recently in the Animal Health and Welfare Scotland Act 2006. Our newly established Scottish Animal Welfare Commission has a specific remit to report annually on how the welfare needs of sentient animals been addressed in all areas of relevant legislation. So I therefore ask Mark Ruskell not to press the 10 amendments seeking to introduce consideration of animal welfare into the guiding principles, or failing that, I invite the committee to reject these amendments. I can move on to Amendment 1053. This is part of a set of 5 amendments that would add a principle of integration to the set of principles. I will be supporting these amendments and also 1003 in the name of Mark Ruskell that supplies the reference to integration in the treaty. The Scottish Government remains of the view that this is not a necessary step to achieve the desired integration of environmental policy, but I am happy to support these amendments as an effective way to respond to the stakeholder concern that this should be more explicit in the guiding principles themselves. The next amendment to consider is 1054 from Claudia Beamish on the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle is best known as it applies to environmental protection, but it can have wider applications such as health. This is not the time or the place to discuss the merits of such a wider approach. Equally, this is not the bill or the set of principles where such an approach should be enshrined. I think if Claudia Beamish does want to argue for a precautionary principle to be applied to matters other than the environment, she can make that case when relevant legislation is being considered. But it can't be right to apply a general precautionary principle under the guise of the guiding principles on the environment, because that's not what we consulted on. This is not a continuation of the effect of the EU environmental principles. This is not fair to stakeholders in those other policy areas who have had no chance to consider or react to such a proposal. So accordingly, I ask Claudia not to press this amendment, or failing that, I ask the committee to reject 1054. I next come to Mark Ruskell's Amendment 1001 on a principle of high-level protection, and the further amendment 1001A from Claudia Beamish adding sustainable development to this principle. Can I say first off that the amendment is not particularly well drafted, and the inclusion of the Scottish ministers in the text of the principle itself would make a bit of a guddle of the application of the principles to other duty holders. However, that's not the primary reason I'm opposing this amendment. The primary reason is that the bill already has provision at Section 12 that I believe will be more effective in protecting the environment than the introduction of a principle of a high level of protection. Section 12 sets out clearly that all those to whom the duty applies are to comply with their duties with a view to protecting and improving the environment and contributing to sustainable development. This is a much more clear and richer expression of the purpose of the provisions and includes reference to improving as well as protecting the environment. So I would hope that Mark Ruskell would not press his Amendment 1001, and I'd recommend that the committee reject this amendment if moved today. So finally, we come to Amendments 1002 and 1003. Amendment 1002 is Mark Ruskell's version of an integration principle. The drafting is flawed because it applies only to the implementation of the Scottish Minister's policies and activities, but the guiding principles apply to other duty holders too. I therefore invite Mr Ruskell not to press this amendment 1002, but instead to support the integration principle introduced by Stuart Stevenson's amendments. I will recommend support for Mark Ruskell's Amendment 1003, as it does provide the definitional reference relevant to the Stuart Stevenson version of the integration principle. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. And just want to do a bit of housekeeping. Mark, I'm not entirely sure you did move your amendment. If you'd like to move it now. That was
Amendment 1022. And all our other amendments in the group.
Right, and now invite Mark Ruskell to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 1022. Mark.
Right, thanks, Convener. Perhaps I'll start with that amendment then about animal sentience. I am disappointed with the lack of progress here because, as I said in my opening comments, we did have several debates about this with the first continuity bill, and I understood that a definition that more fully reflects the European definition of animal sentience was going to be carried forward. I don't know what's happened between then and now. Last week in the Chamber, the Secretary Mike Russell indicated the Animal Welfare Commission were probably looking into this and probably looking into what legal changes may be required going forward. I mean, this is the opportunity here today to ensure continuity with European principles. So, if there's a better way to do this, Cabinet Secretary, I'm really sort of looking to hear what that is. I mean, in light of your comments, I won't move that set of amendments today, but I would seek greater clarification in the run-up to stage 3 about what the government is proposing and which areas of legislation still require to be changed to ensure continuity in that area. If I could turn to Stuart Stevenson's Amendment 1053. I mean, I'm reading the words here, but the words here don't have any basis in European law. It might be continuity with Stuart Stevenson's thinking, but it's not continuity with the European Union. And I think that point is made by the fact that, as he admits himself, Amendment 1003 is needed as a necessary adjunct just to give it some kind of basis in European law. So I'm a little uncomfortable with it, to be honest. I mean, if committee prefers to come up with a new form of words that doesn't relate to the Treaty of the Function of the European Union, isn't in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, then do that. But it's not about strict continuity. So I would have concerns about that. I think with the Cabinet Secretary's points about the other amendments, which again are well-founded, deeply embedded European principles about high-level environmental protection. I'm looking now at the section 12, which he indicated, and again, it doesn't identify here the aim of a high-level environmental protection. It says protecting and improving the environment. I mean, laudable aims, but that could be a little bit, or it could be a lot. It could be a low level of environmental improvement, or it could be a high level environmental improvement. The fact is that all the European treaties and the Charter of Rights point to a high level of environmental protection. Those are the words which are missing, Cabinet Secretary, in the bill. Those are the words that I would like to see included. I mean, in view of your comments, I won't move those amendments today, but I do think we need to potentially return back to that. Convener, I don't have any more comments to make on the amendments just now. Thank you.
Okay, for clarity, I'm going to take in each amendment as it comes. So in this particular case, are you withdrawing Amendment 1022?
I think I'd like to comment. I won't not moved.
And so that amendment is withdrawn. Is the committee content for that to be withdrawn? Yes. Okay. Thank you. I call amendment 1053 in the name of Stuart Stevenson, already debated with amendment 1022. Stuart Stevenson, to move or not move? Stuart, can you say that again, please? We didn't hear you.
1053 is moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 1053 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. No, we're not agreed. Okay, we'll go to division. Okay, I'll do this by roll call. And if you can state clearly if you're for, against or abstaining. I call Claudia Beamish. Say that again, please, Claudia.
For.
Thank you. Finlay Carson.
For.
Thank you. Angus MacDonald.
For.
Gillian Martin's for. Mark Ruskell.
Abstain.
You said thank you.
Abstain.
Liz Smith.
For.
And Stuart Stevenson. Thank you. Okay, the result of that division is that we have total votes for 6, total abstentions 1. Amendments agreed. I call amendment 1054 in the name of Claudia Beamish, already debated with amendment 1022. Claudia Beamish, asks you to move or not move?
Move, convener.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 1054 be agreed. Are we all agreed?
No.
Okay, we're not agreed. We'll therefore have a division. Again, I will call each member. If you just give it a little beat until your microphone is live. Claudia Beamish.
For.
Finlay Carson.
Against.
Angus MacDonald.
Against.
Gillian Martin. Against. Mark Ruskell.
For.
For. Liz Smith.
Against.
Stuart Stevenson.
Against.
Thank you. The results of that division are total votes for 2, total votes against 5. The amendment is disagreed to. I call amendment 1001 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with amendment 1022. I ask Mark Ruskell to move or not move.
Not moved.
That's not moved. I call amendment 1001A in the name of Claudia Beamish, already debated with amendment 1022. I ask Claudia Beamish to move or not move.
Move would be happy to continue discussions. Thank you.
Not moved.
Not moved.
Okay. One zero zero. I call amendment 1002 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with amendment 1002. Mark Ruskell, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. Call amendment 1023 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with amendment 1022. Ask Mark Ruskell to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 1003 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with amendment 1022. Ask Mark Ruskell to move or not move?
Moved.
Moved. The question then is, amendment 1003 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Call amendment 1024 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with amendment 1022, and I ask Mark Ruskell to move or not move.
Not moved.
Thank you. Call amendment 1025 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with amendment 1022, and I ask Mark Ruskell to move or not move.
Not moved.
Call amendment 1026 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with amendment 1022. Ask Mark Ruskell to move or not move.
Not moved.
Not moved. I call amendment 1055 in the name of Stuart Stevenson, already debated with amendment 1022, and ask Stuart Stevenson to move or not move.
I move 1055.
The question is that amendment 1055 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We're not agreed. Okay. Right, the red division, and I'll do the roll call. Again, give it some time for your mic to go live. Claudia Beamish.
For.
Finlay Carson.
For.
Angus MacDonald.
For.
Gillian Martin for. Mark Ruskell.
Abstain.
Liz Smith.
For.
And Stuart Stevenson.
For.
You just get the results of that. No. Okay, the results of that division is that total votes for 6, total votes against 0, total abstentions 1. That vote is then agreed. The question then is that section 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Right, I call amendment 1016 in the name of Claudia Beamish, grouped with amendments 1016A, 1016B and 1057. I call on Claudia Beamish to move amendment 1016 and speak to all amendments in the group. Claudia.
Thank you, Convener, and I move amendment 1016. And That and 1016B and 57 set a statutory requirement for ministers to bring forward an environmental policy strategy to set out their proposals to protect and recover our natural environment in line with the environment principles and in consultation with. This is vital, not least because our natural world is in crisis, with 1 in 9 species in Scotland at the risk of natural extinction, but also because the European Commission is pressing ahead with its new biodiversity strategy to 2030 to address this very crisis. My amendment 1016 sets out much of the detail on this. As drafted, ministers would have 6 months from when this section comes into force to lay its strategy before the Parliament. And I'm happy to discuss details of whether this is too short a timescale or not on reflection in view of the forthcoming election and also the challenges we're facing in the virus. I am aware that the government is developing its own environment strategy, which is of course welcome. However, there is at present no statutory requirement for that strategy to be implemented and for regular monitoring and reporting on whether it has achieved the government's stated outcomes. My Amendment 1016 requires that a strategy is brought forward with a clear mechanism to scrutinise the government's progress, much in the way that we have done with Scotland's climate change ambitions. My Amendment 1016B adds a clarification that Scottish ministers must set out how many targets they propose in the strategy, and that those are legally binding. Again, this is to keep pace with what is emerging from the EU on the creation of a nature recovery target arrangement in the EU's biodiversity strategy to 2030. And furthermore, provisions to set out nature recovery targets for England are included in the UK government's Environment Bill. We are not seeing this element being taken forward in this way in Scotland, and we should, at the very least, match the ambition which is being shown in other parts of the UK. Amendment 1057 follows on from Amendment 1016, requiring that when developing the environmental policies, Scottish ministers not only consider the guiding principles on the environment, but act in accordance with their strategy. This ensures that the strategy is actively implemented, becoming a true guide to Scotland's environmental and nature policies. And finally, I welcome Amendment 1016A in the name of Mark Ruskell, which clarifies that the purpose of the environmental policy strategy is to secure the improved protection, restoration and enhancement of the environment and biodiversity in Scotland. Again, this makes clear what the ultimate aim of Scotland's environment policy should be. Thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you. And call on Mark Ruskell to move Amendment 1016A and speak to other amendments in the group. Mark.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, happy to move 1016A. And can I thank Claudia Beamish for constructive working that we've had in actually not just these amendments, but other amendments under discussion this morning. I think this does return to the debate that we had in the Chamber last week, because if we're to take a twin crisis approach, biodiversity and climate change together, that does mean putting the environment strategy on a statutory basis so that the nature emergency is underpinned with the same status and urgency as the climate emergency. Ministers do need a strong duty to deliver under legally binding targets, and there should be a requirement in law for monitoring and reporting of this. And my Amendment 1016A underlines that core objective for restoration of nature under the strategy and the targets that should flow from that. We need to keep continuity with the ambition on the nature emergency that's already being shown in the European Union, where the EU have committed to a biodiversity strategy up to 2020, which will include nature restoration targets. So that's why these amendments are so critical, and I think reflect what was a broad consensus on the importance of that statutory underpinning last week in the Chamber. Thanks.
Thank you. Call on Finlay Carson to speak to the amendments in the group. Finlay.
Thank you, Convener. Whilst the Scottish Conservatives absolutely appreciate this is a climate and biodiversity emergency, we need to consider the implications of the the COVID-19 pandemic and also the forthcoming elections in May. And I look forward to the Cabinet Secretary coming forward and giving us an indication of the ability of the civil servants to deliver the amendments that are brought forward by Claudia Beamish. But certainly it's something that needs to be tackled as a priority. However, I appreciate that civil servants may find it difficult at this time where there's, as I say, the COVID-19 and the elections imminent.
Thank you. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Convener, as members already know, I did publish a vision for Scotland's environment earlier this year as part of our environment strategy. The publication also included the key outcomes that we need to achieve this vision and set the direction for further work on the strategy, including a strategic environmental assessment. And part of the reason I was keen for Scotland to have a clear environment strategy was to underpin our environmental policy once we are out with the EU, and so to reinforce our commitment to maintain and enhance standards. So I can see that there is a case to build the environment strategy into this bill. However, as I think Claudia and Finlay have already recognised, the amendments in their current form would create some difficulties. The provisions are too inflexible and, frankly, the timescales are not realistic. To be effective, any strategy needs to be developed with a broad range of stakeholders, and if it's going to achieve the desirable aim of increasing the integration of the environment into other areas of policy, we're going to have to involve policymakers and stakeholders in those policy areas as well. So I think that I also think that further development of the strategy has to fit with the work that's already been done. There is a bit of a confusion around the approach to statutory targets in this amendment. I'll shortly be publishing a monitoring framework for the environment strategy that will bring together existing statutory targets, elements of the national performance framework, and indicators from other strategies. Stakeholders contributed to this effort, and there is a wide understanding that this is a complex area with a lot of targets already in place and a lot of technical difficulties in designing meaningful strategic targets. So I'm asking Claudia Beamish not to pursue this amendment in its current form, and I do offer to work with her to design an amendment that sets out an obligation for ministers to continue the work on an environment strategy. And I think that we'll be able to keep the essence of her proposals, but set in a framework that allows for development at a pace that will lead to an effective strategy with broad acceptance with stakeholders and relevance across government. And that can't really be done in this coming 6-month period, which is pretty much all we would have over an extraordinarily complicated time, Brexit, COVID, and including parliamentary elections, and the likelihood of Parliament itself not really being in a position to seriously look at this issue until the autumn of 2021. So I'm asking Claudia to enter into conversations with us and not to press her amendments today.
Thank you. Call on Claudia Beamish to wind up on Amendment 1016. Claudia.
Thank you very much, Convener, and I've listened carefully to what the Cabinet Secretary has said. For the record, Mark Ruskell and I have worked together, as he highlighted, on this and a number of other amendments. Finlay Carson has highlighted the point which I also touched on very briefly, and which now the Cabinet Secretary has elaborated in terms of the challenges, unrealistic challenges, I acknowledge, of a 6-month commitment within my amendment to publishing the legally binding strategy. So I think that interest commitment that there will be an obligation developed in stage 3, as long as it's possible for myself and others with an interest, who I've already highlighted, to work with her, then I would be keen not to move the amendment today. I will also want to highlight that I'll be wanting to have discussion about the statutory targets before we get to stage 3 as well, because I think this is a fundamental part in what our party has declared as a nature emergency, and which was highlighted in the Green debate last week, that legally binding targets will focus the minds of Scotland. So I won't be moving either of those two amendments in my name today. Thank you.
Okay, Claudia, given that you've already moved the amendment, would you like to withdraw it?
I would like to withdraw it. Thank you.
And are committee members content for that amendment to be withdrawn? Thank you. Therefore, I won't be able to call Amendment 1016A either. So we will move on now. And then call Amendment 1056 in the name of Stuart Stevenson, already debated with Amendment 1022, and ask Stuart Stevenson to move or not move that amendment.
I move Amendment 1056.
The question then is that Amendment 1056 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. I call Amendment 1065 in the name of Finlay Carson, grouped with the amendments as shown in the groupings. Please note that procedural information in relation to this group is contained in the groupings. I ask Finlay Carson to move Amendment 1065 and speak to all amendments in the group. Finlay.
Thank you, Convener. I move Amendment. Convener, the amendments in 1065 and 1066 seek to address the have regard to question. In the committee's Stage 1 report, this issue was examined, paragraphs 95 to 105, and the committee's recommendation was that the Scottish Government brings forward amendments at Stage 2 to strengthen the wording in relation to the duty to have regard to the principles. The committee highlights the suggestion made, which includes a duty to have due regard to or to act in accordance with. Liam MacArthur, with amendments 1006 to 1009, has proposed the wording act in accordance with, and these amendments 1065 and 1066 offer alternative of have due regard to. I understand there may be some issues with the act in accordance with amendments. The strength of the duties to apply the principles is an issue that needs to be addressed at this stage of the bill, and the committee recommended this, and it's disappointing the government chose not to respond positively. The same recommendation was made in relation to the UK Environmental Bill by the Westminster Committee that conducted pre-legislative scrutiny. There, the UK government responded by agreeing to have a due regard to approach. These recommendations are, of course, based on stakeholder concern and the stakeholders who have experienced government exercising similar duties. The concern was probably best summarised by the Law Society of Scotland, who the committee quoted in paragraph 94 of the report. They commented that you could have regard to something but attach little or no weight to it. The phrase is, by its nature, limited in scope. The observation is correct. However, the government's response to the committee concluded that they would not propose amendments. It appears to predicate on the different structures of the UK bill and the bill before us. In particular, the government's response said we would also note that equivalent duty in the UK environment bills is a duty on UK ministers to have regard to a policy statement to be published by UK ministers themselves in environmental principles and not to the principles themselves. It's correct in as far as it goes, however, it fails to observe that in section 13 of the bill requires Scottish ministers to publish guidance on the principles and that duty holders must exercise their duty having regard to that guidance. So while the structure may be different, the effect is the same. For these reasons, the duty must be strengthened so as to ensure the principles are applied in a manner that is consistent as possible with the current EU application.
Thank you. And I call on Liam MacArthur to speak to Amendment 1006 and other amendments in the group. Liam.
Thanks very much, Convener. Like Finlay Carson's amendment, and as Finlay's intimated, my amendments 1006 to 1009, strengthen the duty on ministers and public authorities to comply with the overarching principles we discussed earlier. At present, the bill requires ministers to have regard to these principles, and that appears too weak and offers insufficient assurance that policy and actions will indeed adhere to those principles. While Finlay Carson's proposes to beef these up in line with, as he said, the wording found in the equivalent UK bill, i.e. have due regard to, I'm concerned that this in of itself may not even be sufficient. My amendments therefore require ministers and public authorities to act in accordance with the environmental principles that this bill incorporates into Scots law. These amendments are strongly supported by Scottish Environment Link and I believe reflect the Clare Committee Stage 1 report recommendations in this area. On that basis, I hope they attract the support of the committee, and I move Amendment 1006 in my name. Thank you.
I now call on Mark Ruskell to speak to Amendment 1004 and other amendments in the group. Mark.
Thanks very much, Convener. So my amendments 1005 seeks to remove the exemption on applying the environmental principles to matters of budget and finance. No such exclusion applies to the principles in the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. EU finance and budgets are subject to the principles. So if this bill is about providing continuity, the same should apply in Scotland as well. The Cabinet Secretary may argue that budgets do not determine policy, and that in fact all budgets do is implement policy, and it is the policy to which the principles should apply. And although that's maybe correct in theory for many policies, it neglects three issues. First, in practice, spending decisions do not always follow policy. For instance, transport policy is generally at a strategic level in line with environmental ambition, for example, by aiming to meet net zero targets and setting out a transport hierarchy. Yet regularly, we see spending decisions which are essential to implementing these policies not reflect the aims. Road building programmes are prioritised, for example, ahead of spending on active travel infrastructure. Secondly, finance or fiscal policy in itself is a policy with the potential to benefit or harm the environment. The use of green taxes or charges on resource use or for permits are all policies that should be underpinned by the environmental principles. But how can the polluter pays principle be fully applied, for instance, if it's not applied to our choices over taxation? Thirdly, the application of the precautionary principle to budgets should ensure that long-term thinking about the cost of not taking early action is factored in. For example, budgets to tackle non-native invasive species should be seen as long-term preventative measures that will save far more money than they initially cost. It would make sense to consider in the prioritisation of budget spend how preventative spend can deliver better budget outcomes. In the committee's recent report on pre-budget scrutiny, we stated that, and I quote, all public expenditure should be consistent with addressing climate and ecological crises, building a wellbeing economy and delivering a green recovery. And we recommended that the Scottish Government use the next budget to set a pathway towards a green, just and resilient recovery. By backing my Amendment 1005 today, we can ensure that matters of budget and finance are in line with the key environmental principles for all future budgets. My Amendment 1004 seeks to remove another exemption, this time in relation to defence matters. And I'm sure members will have examples of where the Ministry of Defence acting in Scotland should be showing better regard to environmental principles out with periods of national emergency. One example is Dalgety Bay, where radioactive pollution from World War II waste disposal continues to pollute the local beach. Consideration of the polluter pays principle should have resulted in the MOD progressing the clean-up of the Fife Coast decades ago. Another example is the generation of acoustic noise pollution associated with naval exercises, a real problem for beaked whales on the west coast of Scotland, where in 2018 there was the largest mass stranding recorded in the world. The MOD should be undertaking acoustic monitoring of offshore habitats for beaked whales they operate in, as required under the EU Habitats Directive. The MOD should then be using that field data and environmental impact assessments and to consider reporting out, to consider operating outside of these beaked whale habitats until these EIAs have actually been finalised. So my Amendment 1004 would ensure greater consideration is given by the MOD Scotland's environment. Finally, we've had detailed evidence in committee from experts in environmental law about the deficiencies in the have regard to phrase, as Finlay Carson and Liam MacArthur have already outlined. It's clearly weaker than what we have in the UK Environment Bill. And if we're serious in delivering environmental principles, then acting in accordance with says what we mean. It says that policy will be based on the principles, and that form of words, will be based on the principles, is in line with the Treaty of the Function of the European Union. So I hope that committee will support Liam MacArthur's amendment to deliver that objective. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Now calling the Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 1029 and other amendments in the group. Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks, Convener. Obviously, there's quite a lot of amendments in this group. I'm going to speak first to the group of amendments in the name of Liam MacArthur, amendments 1006, 1007, 1008 and 1009. He's intending to change the form of the duty on the Scottish ministers, on ministers of the Crown and on responsible authorities required to carry out an SEA. In all cases, Liam MacArthur seeks to amend the form of the duty to act in accordance with the guiding principles. Now, the duties on ministers under sections 10 subsection 1 and 10 subsection 2 of the bill are to have regard to the guiding principles on the environment in developing policies, including proposals for legislation in relation to Scotland. The duty and responsible authorities under section 11 is to have regard to the guiding principles when considering anything that would require an SEA. It remains my clear view that the current wording of the duty to have regard to is effective and proportionate and will work well with the other duties and functions of ministers and public bodies. I am aware that there has been debate about the framing of the duties in respect of the guiding principles on the environment, stretching back to the consultation paper last year. The duties to have regard to the guiding principles reflect the effect of the environmental principles in EU law. The guiding principles on the environment are important guides to decision making, but we need to ensure that the duties in respect of these principles, those on ministers and on public authorities, are proportionate and effective and work well with the wider range of statutory duties and other relevant factors that ministers and public authorities may have to consider in any decision-making process. Therefore, it's important that while the environmental principles are taken into account in decision-making, these duties should not be framed in a manner which would result in them dominating all other duties and objectives. We believe that the duty to have regard strikes this balance appropriately. Liam MacArthur's amendments to change the form of the duties to act in accordance with the principles would constrain the ability to take into account other legitimate considerations when developing policy. Indeed, it is possible that if the environmental principles duty was specified in these terms, it could lead to perverse effects or hold up decision making. It's a very strong form of duty, generally seen in places such as company law, where directors must act in accordance with very specific rules and provisions, and other places where there are clear, detailed rules that must be followed. The guiding principles on the environment, as is the case with the EU environmental principles, are guides to decision making of a subjective nature, requiring interpretation and application to individual situations. They're not rules or procedure which can be precisely followed. And this would have a particular impact on local authorities who have a wide range of duties and objectives to balance and produce a lot of SEAs, particularly for strategic planning functions. We have had a discussion about the form of duty that's proposed in the bill with COSLA, who also responded formally to the 2019 consultation. There's broad agreement that the proposals in the bill are proportionate and would ensure an appropriate place for the guiding principles in the level of project and plan that is subject to environmental assessment. So I think that the ultimate impact of a duty to act in accordance with the guiding principles would not be known until tested in court. However, it's possible to foresee some potential impacts of such a duty. a duty to act in accordance with the precautionary principle could lead to disproportionate expenditure to protect against very low probability events. A duty to act in accordance with the polluter pays principle could prevent provision for grants to assist the most vulnerable in society with energy efficiency. After all, a domestic householder is by definition a polluter. Generally, there would be conflicts between a duty to act in accordance with and other policy goals and with other statutory duties. So for these reasons, I do urge Liam McArthur not to press these amendments, and if they are pressed, for the committee to reject them and the consequential 1006, 1007 and 1008 and the consequential amendment 1009. If I could turn now to Finlay Carson's amendments 1065 and 1066, these seek to change the duties on Scottish ministers and on responsible authorities to have due regard to the guiding principles. Finlay Carson isn't seeking to amend the duty on ministers of the Crown, as I understand it. I'm aware that the equivalent duty in the UK Environment Bill has been amended to have due regard to. However, I would emphasise to the committee that there are significant differences between the bills. In the first place, the duty in the UK bill does only apply to UK ministers. Secondly, unlike the duty in our bill, secondly, the duty in the UK bill applies not to the guiding principles themselves, but to a guidance document separately written by UK ministers. And thirdly, there is a condition placed on this document that there should be proportionality between environmental and other policy goals. So it remains my clear view that the current wording of the duty to have regard to is effective and proportionate and will work well with other duties and functions of ministers and public bodies. I'm not sure that Finlay Carson has worked through the interaction of his amendments with duties on UK authorities, and I don't think it's right that there are amendments before the committee today that would lead to a different specification of the duty in different places. So I would ask Finlay Carson not to press his amendments today so that we can have discussions with him about the framing of those duties ahead of stage 3. But if they do come to a vote today, I would ask the committee to reject them. If I could turn now to consider amendments 1004 and 1005 from Mark Ruskell, which seek to remove the exemption from the principal's duty for defence and for finance or budgets. The provisions at section 10.3 of the bill reflect the exclusions in the Environmental Assessment Scotland Act 2005 and the European Environmental Assessment Directive. National defence was never within the competence of the EU. Therefore, to include defence in relation to our own domestic guiding principles of the environment would not be a continuation of their effect in the EU. I can't see any good reason for removing this exemption. Where considerations in relation to MOD sites relate to policy areas which are not specifically related to defence, such as water abstraction, that will already be in the scope of the principles. So many significant environmental policies also have some financial consequences, and the intention is not to exclude policies on that basis, in the same way that such policies are not exempt from the requirements of the 2005 Act. Rather, the intention of the provision at section 10.3 removes purely financial and budgetary processes from the scope of the duty. This is in a similar manner to the 2005 Act. The intent of this exclusion will be explained in guidance, again in a similar manner to the guidance on environmental assessment. It's unclear how the guiding principles could apply to the budgetary process itself. The guiding principles will have their due place in influencing the design of the policies, which are then subject to the budgetary process. I don't believe that these exclusions will have any impact on the achievement of environmental objectives. So I urge Mark Ruskell not to press these amendments, and I urge the committee to reject them if they are pressed. The next amendment to be considered is 1029, which is in my name. This amendment has the effect of taking away from ministers the power to make regulations to remove more matters from the scope of the principal's duty. On consideration of comments about the initial proposal, not least from the DPLRC, I concluded that this power could not really be justified, and ministers had no intention of taking any further matters out of the scope of the principles. So I recommend that the committee supports Amendment 1029, which would preempt 1059 lodged by Alec Rowley, which seeks to apply the affirmative procedure to the making of the regulations procedure, and clearly that is not required if the power is removed altogether. Finally, if I could turn to Angus MacDonald's Amendment 1017, as members will know, it's indeed our attention that the environmental principles are considered by responsible authorities in carrying out environmental assessments, and that this consideration and the impact on decisions is reported in environmental reports. This was the reason for aligning the duty with the requirement for an SEA. However, the means to achieve this through guidance under this bill is both sufficient and more effective than this amendment, and it allows us to set out in far greater detail how this should be achieved through the stages of the process of environmental assessment. So I don't believe this amendment is necessary, and I invite Angus MacDonald not to press Amendment 1017.
Thank you. And now we move on to call Alec Rowley to speak to Amendment 1059 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. This amendment would provide that regulation under Section 10(4) would be subject to affirmative procedure, which would ensure a higher standard of parliamentary scrutiny in the making of those regulations. But as the Cabinet Secretary said, 1029 preempts that, and I would certainly be supportive of the 1029, which would mean that there would not be a requirement for my amendment. Thank you.
Okay. I now call on Angus MacDonald to speak to Amendment 1017 and other amendments in the group. Angus.
Okay, thank you, Convener. I'll keep this contribution brief. The Amendment 1017 sought to ensure that when public authorities apply the EU environmental principles during the SCA process, it's also their responsibility to set out how this has been done. So in short, the purpose of the amendment is to add transparency and scrutiny to the process. However, in light of the Cabinet Secretary's comments, I would be minded not to press the amendment.
Okay. And call on Claudia Beamish to speak to the amendments in this group.
Thank you, Convener. I will be as brief as I can. I had considered supporting Liam MacArthur's Amendment Act in accordance with, because of the vital importance to the future of Scotland, to our environment, of course, that this amendment would lead to. However, I've listened to the Cabinet Secretary, and I'm now less minded to support it for some of the reasons that she gave. If Finlay Carson decides to press his amendments on have due regard to today, I will be strongly supportive of those, because I think have due regard to, and I stress the word due, will enable there to be evidence shown in a more clear way that they have been regarded, these fundamentally important principles. However, I will listen very carefully to what Finlay Carson says as to if he decides not to or to withdraw the amendment or whatever, because of what the Cabinet Secretary has said about looking at the detail. But in principle, that's where I want to be. In terms of national defence, I think the points that Mark Ruskell makes about Dalgety Bay and acoustic noise are really important examples. And I'm not able to support that amendment today because I think there should be more clarity. But the Cabinet Secretary used an example of water, but issues that the Ministry of Defence would have to deal with in a different way, because would have to deal with anyway because of legislation. But I do have concerns about the slowness of the Ministry of Defence on dealing. Although I don't feel I can support it today, I think there should be more clarity on this. I'm very supportive of Mark Ruskell's amendment on making sure that there is not an exemption for finance, and I'm not going to reiterate the reasons he gave, but I absolutely align myself with that. And indeed, as I understand it, this does follow the EU. And I think finance is utterly in need of scrutiny because the policies may be wrong, may be right, but the finance may be wrong, as he says, in a nutshell. Supportive of the Cabinet Secretary's amendment 1029 and respect Alec Riley for withdrawing his on the basis he explained, and also respect for Angus MacDonald for his position. So I think that sums it up. Thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you. And I call on Finlay Carson to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 1065.
Thank you, Convener. I still believe that the duty must be strengthened to ensure that the principles are applied in a manner as consistently as possible with the current EU. I table these amendments to do that as an alternative to Liam's amendments, and bearing in mind the Cabinet Secretary's response to Liam's amendments. At this stage, I welcome the assurance that the Cabinet Secretary will work with me and others to strengthen at stage 3, and on that basis, I will withdraw my amendment and look forward to discussions with the Cabinet Secretary.
Okay, so that 1065 has been withdrawn. Are members content that that is withdrawn? Yes, it looks like we are. Yes, right, we're content. We'll move on. Call Amendment 1006 in the name of Liam MacArthur, already debated with Amendment 1065, and ask Liam MacArthur to move formally.
Can I move 1006, Convener?
Thank you. Question then is that Amendment 1006 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We're not agreed, then have a division. I'll do the roll call. Okay, Claudia Beamish.
Against.
Finlay Carson.
Against.
Against. Angus MacDonald.
Against.
Gillian Martin against. Mark Ruskell.
For.
Liz Smith.
Against.
Thank you. And Stuart Stevenson.
Against.
Thank you. We'll get the results of the division. Right, the results of the division on 1006 are total votes for 1, total votes against 6, and 0 abstentions. 1006 is not agreed to. Call Amendment 1027 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with Amendment 1022, and ask Mark Ruskell to move or not move.
Not moved.
Not moved. Call Amendment 1057 in the name of Claudia Beamish, already debated with Amendment 1016, and ask Claudia Beamish to move or not move.
Not move, Convener.
Call Amendment 1058 in the name of Stuart Stevenson, already debated with Amendment 1022, and ask Stuart Stevenson to move or not move.
I move Amendment 1058.
Thank you. The question then is that Amendment 1058 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Call Amendment 1007 in the name of Liam MacArthur, already debated with Amendment 1065. Ask Liam MacArthur to move or not move.
Thanks, Convener. I'll not move 1007, and can I also indicate I will not be moving 1008 or 1009? I'm slightly concerned that 1009 I think is your penultimate amendment, and I'm also due to be in the Justice Committee. But given the votes on the earlier amendment, it seems sensible not to move any of the remaining three. That's okay.
Okay, we'll take a note. We'll take a note of that. I'll just check it with my clerk. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Convener.
Okay. I call Amendment 1028 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with Amendment 1022, and ask Mark Ruskell to move or not move.
Not moved.
Call Amendment 1004 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with Amendment 1065, and ask Mark Ruskell to move or not move.
Not moved.
Call Amendment 1005 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with Amendment 1065. Ask Mark Ruskell to move or not move.
Moved.
The question then is that Amendment 1005 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. Okay, I'll do the roll call. Claudia Beamish.
For.
Finlay Carson.
Against.
Angus MacDonald.
Against.
Gillian Martin against. Mark Ruskell.
For.
I didn't hear you, Liz. Could you say that again, please?
Against.
Thank you. Stuart Stevenson.
Against.
Thank you. I'll get the results of that vote. Okay, the result of the vote on Amendment 1005. Total votes for 2, total votes against 5, no abstentions. It is not agreed to. I call Amendment 1029 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1065, and ask the Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Move formally.
I'll point out that if Amendment 1029 is agreed to, we will not be calling Amendment 1059 preemption. Take the question mark away from that and make that a statement. The question is that Amendment 1029 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The question then is that Section 10 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Amendment 1066 in the name of Finlay Carson, already debated with Amendment 1065. Ask Finlay Carson to move or not move.
Not move.
Amendment 118 in the name of Liam MacArthur. He's already said he's going to not move it.
Not move.
Correct. Thank you. Call 3-0 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with Amendment 1022. Ask Mark Ruskell to move or not move.
Not moved.
Was that? Thank you.
Not moved.
Not moved. Thank you. Call Amendment 1017 in the name of Angus MacDonald, already debated with Amendment 1065. Ask Angus MacDonald to move or not move.
Not moved.
Thank you. The question is that Section 11 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Right, I call Amendment 1031 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with Amendments 1032, 1014, 1049, 1050 and 1051. Please note the procedural information in relation to this group as contained in the groupings. I ask the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 1031 and speak to all the amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. These amendments expand the definition of the environment in the bill to expressly include habitats and species in response to concerns by stakeholders raised at stage 1 of this bill. These are the amendments 1031, 32, 49, 50 and 51 in my name. Officials consulted further with NatureScot to draw up these amendments. They provide an expanded definition of the environment and make it clear that the references to the environment in sections 12 and 40 of the bill include wild animal and plant life and their habitats, which appears to have been the issue at the heart of stakeholders' concerns. They ensure consistency between the two definitions of the environment in Part 2 of the bill and put beyond doubt that ESS functions and governance arrangements do extend to the domestic legislation transposing the Habitats and Birds Directive, so far as that legislation is within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament. If I could now turn to Amendment 1014 in the name of Claudia Beamish, I have accepted the need to respond to stakeholder concerns about the definition of the environment in the bill, but I'm not sure that Claudia Beamish's amendment is the way to do it. It is not clear how the definition in Claudia Beamish's amendment would interact with other provisions in the bill, and it would be difficult to interpret provisions about measures that protect, maintain or restore the environment in this definition. It's a list of things which is appropriate for the environmental information regulations, but is not as effective in this context as a simpler approach taken in the government amendments. Moreover, it doesn't make sense for the protection of the environment to include the protection or restoration of genetically modified organisms. I'm not quite sure what that really was about. Therefore, we can't support Claudia Beamish's amendment, and I would ask her not to press that to a vote, and I move 1031 in my name.
Thank you. I call on Claudia Beamish to speak to Amendment 1014 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. And my amendment 1014 seeks to address the concerns the committee heard at stage 1 during taking of evidence that the bill's definition of the environment as currently drafted in section 40 omits habitats, species and landscapes. I'm pleased the Cabinet Secretary has also noted these concerns in her own amendments. However, my approach has been to seek continuity with existing definitions and to add clarity and completeness. My amendment takes the existing definition of the environment as contained in the Environmental Information Scotland Regulations 2004, which has previously been agreed and found to function well, rather than seeking a new definition for this legislation. Members will note that this approach has been given the support of Scottish Environment Link. The definition states environment includes all water elements such as air, atmosphere, water, soil, land, landscape and natural sites, including wetlands, coastal and marine areas, biological diversity and its components, including genetically modified organisms and the interaction among these elements. Now, I recognise the point that the Cabinet Secretary has highlighted in relation to genetically modified organisms. However, that is the full definition from the from what has come before, as I said, in the Environmental Information Scotland Regulations 2004. And so I didn't want to simply cut the end of that off. This is also in line with the definition in the EU's Access to Environmental Information Directive, enhancing the continuity of our bill with existing European arrangements, which is, of course, the key to it all. So I make those points. Thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you. I call to Colin Finlay Carson to speak to the amendments in this group. Finlay.
Thank you, Convener. I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's confirmation that she was going to take action on concerns brought up not only by Nature Scotland around the definition of the environment, which omitted habitats and species. So I appreciate and will support the Cabinet Secretary clarification and inclusion of this amendment in the legislation.
Thank you. Colin, Cabinet Secretary, to wind up.
I don't think there's anything further I want to add. I made clear that I think lifting a definition out of regulations into legislation isn't really an appropriate way forward. I think in respect of everything else, my position is as stated at the outset.
Thank you. The question then is that Amendment 1031 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We're not agreed, therefore I will do the roll call. Claudia Beamish.
Against, Convener.
Finlay Carson.
Agree.
Angus MacDonald.
Agree.
Gillian Martins for. Mark Ruskell.
Abstain.
Liz Smith.
For.
Stuart Stevenson.
Agree.
Okay, I'll just get the results. The results of the votes on Amendment 1031, total votes for 5, total votes against 1, total abstentions 1, therefore that amendment is agreed to. Call Amendment 1032 in the name of Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1031, and ask the Cabinet Secretary to move or not move. The question then is that Amendment 1032 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. We're agreed. The question then is that Section 12 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Okay, thank you. We are agreed. Call Amendment 1033 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with Amendment 1022, and ask Mark Ruskell to move or not move.
Not moved.
Right, the question is that Section 13 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The question is that Section 14 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you, we are agreed. Amendment 1034 in the name of Mark Ruskell, grouped with the amendments as shown in the groupings. Please note the procedural information in relation to this group as contained in the groupings. Call Mark Ruskell to move Amendment 1034 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thanks very much, Convener. I'm happy to move Amendment 1034. During our Stage 1 evidence, we heard from stakeholders that the model of a non-ministerial office, which is proposed for Environmental Standards Scotland, is at risk of not being sufficiently independent of government. And under this model, the government would be involved in ESS's recruitment, reporting and operation, as well as in setting ESS's budget. In fact, I gather the interim body is already being recruited by government and may just morph into the new body in this legislation. In our Stage 1 report, the committee highlighted that we are, and I quote, not yet convinced that a non-ministerial office would provide ESS with sufficient distance and autonomy from the Scottish Government. And I think that's reflected in the range of amendments that we have today to increase Parliament's involvement in the appointments and increase the transparency of ESS's funding arrangements. So amendments 1034 to 1041 propose ESS is set up in the model of a parliamentary commission. And I take the view that establishing Scotland's new watchdog as a parliamentary commission represents the best approach to ensuring that it is fully independent of government. And to explain why I've come to that view, I want to draw the committee's attention to points raised by Professor Campbell Gemmell in a report commissioned by Scottish Environment Link last year. And he raises the following really important points. Firstly, that an independent parliamentary commissioner would have the powers and resources to perform independent assessments, checks and investigations, and that it would sit outside of the government of the day and its agencies. This is a model that is in place in New Zealand, which has a parliamentary commissioner for the environment who leads a small multidisciplinary team to investigate issues including but not limited to river water quality, invasive species and coastal management. And much of that commissioner's work, the report highlights, is undertaken on the back of public complaints or requests, and a lot of effort goes into assessing these issues and engaging with public authorities to seek resolutions to them. So amendments 1034 to 1036 make small drafting changes to accommodate this change. The new body would be known as Environmental Standards Commission. Amendment 1037 requires the chair is appointed by the Scottish Parliament. Amendment 1038 sets out the conditions that would disqualify a person from being appointed to the board under a parliamentary commission model, while Amendment 1039 sets out the detail of commissioners' terms in office, while Amendment 1041 sets out the terms of the Commission's financial arrangements. If we want an independent body that operates more like a commission than a non-ministerial office, then we should call it what it is, a commission, give it a clear role, powers and operation. And that's why I want to put this option on the table in front of committee this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. I call on Claudia Beamish to speak to Amendment 1060 and other amendments in the group. Claudia.
Thank you, Convener. The success of the ESS hinges on its ability to robustly hold Scottish ministers and public authorities to account in relation to environmental complaints. That is why Schedule 1, Part 1 is concerning and significant, in my view. On the face of it, ESS is stated to be, I quote, not subject to the direction or control of any member of the Scottish Government, unquote. However, this is immediately followed by an exception that is, and I quote, provision in this or any other enactment, unquote. This, to me, gives the government a great deal of flexibility to curtail the ESS's independence in any future legislation or future revision of the bill before us. Indeed, at a Stage 1 report, this committee recognised this as an area of concern. My amendment 1060 seeks to clarify that the exemption is not intended to have such a broad scope. Instead, it adds clarification that Scottish ministers can only direct or control, and that's a quote, direct or control ESS in order to take account of changes in, and I again quote, public authority and accounting requirements. This, I understand from the Scottish Government response to the committee Stage 1 report, is in line with the government's reasoning for including such an exception in the first place, but makes clear this now on the face of the bill. If the Scottish Government can indicate, at stage 2 today that it is willing to discuss the enlarging of the specific list of exemptions before stage 3, I would be willing not to move this amendment today. The amendment also builds in protection of ESS's independence against any further future government, which perhaps many years from now may seek greater control and direction of a watchdog with the power to take it to task as we approach critical years for climate and nature. My further amendment 1010 increases Parliament's involvement in the recruitment of the ESS's board. In our stage 1 report, we noted that the interim board appointments process has had little engagement, understandably because it needed to be set up very rapidly, with the Parliament to date, and there is a need for genuine parliamentary involvement in the appointments to the statutory board. My amendment sets a requirement that Parliament signs off on terms and conditions of any appointments to the board, in other words, the person's specification or experience requirements. It is noted that this is only for the long-term board, I stress, and not the interim board. My amendment 1011 further requires Scottish ministers seek nominations or recommendations for ESS board members from Parliament. This would ensure there is a truly open and collaborative approach to the watchdog's recruitment, which I'm sure aligns with the Cabinet Secretary's intention to have a transparent process. Again, this is for the long-term board. In terms of Alex Rowley's amendment, which he will speak to, so I'll be very brief, I'm supportive of this. That's 1061, and with slightly more flesh on the bones, I comment on being supportive of Mark Ruskell's amendments in relation to making our new watchdog body to follow on from the EU a commission. I think this is of fundamental importance if we are to send the right message to the people of Scotland and beyond Scotland that this is indeed an independent body, and that I think the word commission may seem like sort of it's not important, but I think in order to enable it to function independently, that this is the best message that can be sent. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. I call on Angus MacDonald to speak to Amendment 1021 and other amendments in the group.
Okay, thank you, Convener. This Amendment 1021 provides for an additional requirement to the appointment process, which seeks to underline the need for the chair and members of ESS to be qualified and/or experienced in matters relevant to its functions. While the current recruitment process for members of the interim non-statutory body appears to follow this good practice, this amendment would ensure that that continues to be the case in further recruitment rounds and under future governments. The drafting of this amendment follows the precedent set by Section 11 of the Land Reform Scotland Act 2016 in setting out the desired type of experience and experience for members of a public body. It also mirrors the approach taken in Schedule 1 of the UK Environment Bill in relation to appointments to the Office of Environmental Protection in England. So in effect, this amendment ensures that the Board of ESS includes members with a range of environmental expertise or experience relevant to the functions, and while the current recruitment process for the non-statutory board appears to follow this good practice, this amendment would ensure this continues to be the case for future rounds of recruitment. Thank you.
Thank you. I call on Alec Rowley to speak to Amendment 1061 and other amendments in the group. Alec.
Thank you, Convener. This amendment would impose a duty on Scottish ministers to consult with the Chair of Environmental Standards Scotland prior to giving notice to remove a member, and the purpose of that would be that the consultation provides for an additional layer of scrutiny. A requirement on Scottish ministers to consult with the Chair of Environmental Standards Scotland will help to ensure openness and transparency of Scottish ministers' actions. Thank you.
Thank you. Colin Stewart Stevenson to speak to amendments in this group. Stuart.
Thank you very much, Convener. I think there's a bit of a false argument being deployed here, and I'm not terribly in favour of commissions that are entirely independent of government. I actually think it lets government off the hook because it's now the commission that's in front of Parliament rather than the responsible minister. But I think we look at how the UK Climate Change Committee works. It is able to independently report on and advise the 4 governments in the UK. It is, however, also required to take inputs from and do research commissioned by governments. So having that relationship that is to government, and of course Commission and its chief executive has appeared to on a significant number of occasions, is a better model than the Commission, which detaches this all from government and actually means that government, in a sense, can say, well, actually, we don't have to say anything about this at the moment. That's the Commission's job. I'd rather have ministers, when it's necessary to do so, being responsible to Parliament on a timetable that Parliament determines. So I will listen to the debate carefully, but I've always had a bit of a concern about commissions, and they're not alleviated by the debate so far. Convener.
Thank you. And I call on Liz Smith to speak to the amendments in this group. Liz.
Thank you, Convener. I've just got 2 very brief points to make. I had sympathy for the principles that were developed by both Claudia Beamish and by Alex Rowley, because I think it's very important that there are checks and balances on ministerial power and regarding the independence of Environmental Standards Scotland. I think that's good, but I have to say I'm not comfortable with the drafting of these amendments, and therefore we won't be supporting them. But I do think there are further discussions to be had about this whole issue, and therefore hopefully that can take place before stage 3. Thank you.
Thank you. And call on Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. This is obviously a set of pretty fundamental amendments from Mark Ruskell to change the entire established structure of a future governance body from a non-ministerial office to a parliamentary commission. Amendments 1034, 1035, 1036, 1037, 1038, 1039 and 1041. The committee stage 1 report did ask for further information about why the government was proposing a model of a non-ministerial office. I gave a fairly detailed response to this point, and I'm not going to go into back into that detail now. I would simply emphasise once again that it is my belief that the model currently in the bill gives the Environment Standards Scotland the highest level of independence. I also believe that an independent body sitting between ministers and Parliament provides a better continuity from current arrangements. And I think perhaps if I could just put it in simple terms, ESS is outside the government of the day. It's part of the Scottish administration, but it's not part of the Scottish government. However, I think the main point I would make today is that the pressure of time is now very much against us. The end of the transition period is now only some 5 weeks away. I have presented a plan to set up ESS on a shadow basis from 1st January and then have it move to a full statutory basis once the bill is enacted. I know there are challenges to this plan, however, it is the only plan that I'm aware of that is available. Unless there are some preparations going on that I'm not aware of, my understanding is that switching to a parliamentary commissioner model at this point would mean that there would not be the remotest possibility of a workable body in place by the 1st of January and a substantial gap from then on until this arrangement could be put in place. Even if the Parliament had the capacity to take this forward, this potential for a governance gap should really give us all cause for concern. So I would invite Mark Ruskell not to press these amendments, but if they do come to a vote, I would ask that the committee reject them. I'll now turn to Claudia Beamish's Amendment 1060 that seeks to restrict the provision at paragraph 1.2 of Schedule 1. As members will no doubt recall from the lengthy discussion at Stage 1, the purpose of paragraph 1.1 of Schedule 1 is to emphasise the independence of the ESS. The paragraph provides that in performing its functions, ESS is not subject to the direction or control of any member of the Scottish Government. Similar provisions are included in other acts establishing bodies with similar status. Paragraph 1.2 of Schedule 1 provides that subparagraph 1 is subject to any contrary provision in this or any other enactment. It's an absolutely standard provision with no suggestion of it having created problems anywhere else. The legislation which established the Scottish Fiscal Commission and Revenue Scotland also contains similar qualifications, and it's necessary to ensure that the annual accounts of the new body are subject to the appropriate directions from the Scottish ministers, and that's the point that I think Claudia Beamish has reflected in her amendment. However, the provision in paragraph 1.2 of Schedule 1 also serves other purposes. It is necessary for other provisions in this bill which specifically confer functions on Scottish ministers in relation to ESS, such as the powers of ministers to appoint members in paragraph 2, though clearly those powers of Scottish ministers are themselves to be subject to parliamentary approval as a result of paragraph 2.2. Scottish ministers also have powers to approve the remuneration that ESS provides for its members and to approve the terms and conditions on which ESS appoints its staff who will be civil servants. In addition, there will be a range of other duties imposed on public bodies in legislation over the years that will involve some direction from the Scottish Government, for example, in the form of guidance or regulations. Examples would include the public sector climate change duty and duties on public bodies under the Equality Act. It is not uncommon for duties placed on all public authorities to include some involvement of ministers in interpreting or monitoring the duty. There's no reason that ESS should be exempt from the normal range of duties on public bodies that have been established in legislation. In general, we've presented a model for ESS that provides for a high degree of independence. Appointments are subject to confirmation by this Parliament, and the body has to subject its strategy to the approval of Parliament. There is no intention to use the provision at paragraph 1.2 of Schedule 1 in conjunction with new legislative proposals put forward limits on the independence of ESS. Rather, this provision allows for the imposition of general conditions, such as financial reporting requirements, and even then only through legislation, which itself will have been subject to parliamentary scrutiny. The Amendment 1060 from Claudia Beamish would place restrictions on the provision at Schedule 1, paragraph 1.2 that could make other provisions of this bill potentially unworkable or unclear in their effect, and would seem to take ESS out of the scope of some general duties on public bodies. The amendment is unnecessary as the provision at 1.2 cannot be used by ministers to exert any control other than is allowed for specifically in the bill or other legislation. So I invite Claudia Beamish not to press Amendment 1060, or failing that, I invite the committee to reject it. The balance of this group is taken up by 4 amendments on the appointment of members to ESS. We should all be clear that these provisions will affect future regulated appointment rounds under the bill when enacted. This will mean that there is supervision of the process from the Commissioner for Ethics in Public Life, and that the Scottish Government will work fully within the agreed process for appointments that will be subject to parliamentary approval. I therefore argue that Claudia Beamish's amendments 1010 and 1011 are unnecessary, as there is full provision to ensure a correct process between ministers and Parliament for these future regulated appointments. There's also the potential for a conflict between her amendments and the provisions for regulated appointments. For example, I don't understand how the proposal for Parliament to nominate names would fit into the steps a regulated appointments process would involve. I therefore invite her not to press these amendments. If they're brought to vote, I invite the committee to oppose them. The next amendment is 1021 from Angus MacDonald and suggests a range of experience that ministers should consider when considering making appointments to ESS, and I'm happy to support this amendment and ask the committee to agree to it. And finally, Alec Rowley's Amendment 1061 makes sensible provision for ministers to consult the chair of ESS before contemplating proposing the removal of another member to the Parliament for reasons that they are unable to perform their functions or unsuitable to continue. This would, of course, be best practice, and I'm happy to support the amendment so that it is a requirement on ministers in these circumstances. I'm not sure that there is anything further to. Yes, I would just simply advise committee to support Alec Rowley's amendment.
Thank you. Right, I invite Mark Ruskell to wind up and to press or withdraw Amendment 1034. Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I think on hearing that, I will press Amendment 1034. I think it's really important that this committee has the option of a commission in front of it and has the ability to decide on whether that is something that it wants or not. I take on board the concerns that the Cabinet Secretary has around, the practicalities of this, around timescale. I mean, none of us are really in the position that we want to be with the end of the withdrawal period, with a potential governance gap emerging here. But I think, as Claudia Beamish said, it's really important that this body is set up at the outset in the right way and that it's future-proofed, particularly for those critical years when we're going to need to be meeting targets and making very hard decisions in say, 2030 and 2045. So getting it right early on is important. I mean, I listened to Stuart's comments around the benefits or otherwise, or disbenefits of a parliamentary commission, but I think there's something missing here in your argument, Stuart, and that's about the role of Parliament here. I think commissions, independent commissions, have a hugely important role, but it's up then for Parliament and parliamentary committees to then use their work, which is independent and is robust, to then do its job of holding ministers to account. I think that's where a commission sits, and I think an independent commission has an important role to play there. As for other amendments in this group, listen to what the Cabinet Secretary said. Certainly support Angus MacDonald's amendment to try and broaden the expertise. And I think, Alec Rowley makes an important point about the requirement to consult with a chair. But of course, we need a chair that is robust and is fully independently appointed as well. So I'm happy to support those amendments too. Thanks.
Thank you. The question then is that Amendment 1034 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We're not agreed. Okay, I'll do the roll call. Claudia Beamish.
For, Convener.
Finlay Carson.
Against.
Angus MacDonald.
Against.
Gillian Martin against. Mark Ruskell.
For.
Liz.
Against.
And Stuart Stevenson.
Against.
Here, we'll just look at the results of that vote. Okay, the results of the vote on Amendment 1034. Total votes for 2, total votes against 5. Amendment 134 is disagreed to. Call Amendment 1035 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with Amendment 1034, and ask Mark Ruskell to move or not move.
Can I not move 1035, and can I also not move 1036?
Thank you. Therefore, the question is that Section 15 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Colleagues, I would like to offer you a 5-minute comfort break. We will come back at 10:30. And we're back on our stage 2 considerations. I now call Amendment 1060 in the name of Claudia Beamish, already debated with Amendment 1034, and ask Claudia Beamish to move or not move.
Not move, convener, on the basis I'll consider further before stage 3. Thank you.
Thank you. Call Amendment 1037 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with Amendment 1034, not moved.
Thanks.
Call Amendment 1010 in the name of Claudia Beamish, already debated with Amendment 1034. Ask Claudia Beamish to move or not move.
Not moved again. I'll explore further before stage 3.
Thank you. I call Amendment 1011 in the name of Claudia Beamish, already debated with Amendment 1034. Ask Claudia Beamish to move or not move.
Not moved, convener, on the same basis. Thank you.
Call Amendment 1021 in the name of Angus MacDonald, already debated with Amendment 1034. Ask Angus MacDonald to move or not move.
Moved, convener.
The question is that Amendment 1021 be agreed to. Are we? We're all agreed. Thank you. Call Amendment 1038 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with Amendment 1034. Ask Mark Ruskell to move or not move that amendment.
Could I not move this amendment and also 1039?
Thank you. Call Amendment 1061 in the name of Alec Rowley, already debated with Amendment 1034. Ask Alec Rowley to move or not move that amendment.
Moved, convener.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 1061 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. Call Amendment 1067 in the name of Mark Ruskell, grouped with Amendment 1068. Call Mark Ruskell to move Amendment 1067 and speak to both amendments in the group.
Thanks, convener. Happy to move 1067. The independence of ESS depends in part on the adequacy of its funding, which of course will be provided by Scottish ministers. And I've got 2 amendments in this group aimed at increasing the transparency of ESS's funding and then helping with that question that we're grappling with around the independence of ESS. Firstly, Amendment 1067, which is modelled on the UK Environment Bill, requires that ministers ensure that the funding of ESS is sufficient for it to do its work. And I think this is reasonable and a reassurance to this Parliament that future ministers will not be able to indirectly control the work of ESS by restricting its funds. If that is a commitment that the UK Secretary of State can make to the UK Parliament in relation to the Office of Environmental Protection, I don't understand why ministers here could not accept such a similar commitment in relation to ESS. Adding to that, my Amendment 1068 ensures transparency and scrutiny to the process of funding by adding a requirement that ESS's annual reports to ministers in Parliament must include an assessment of whether the funding provided in that financial year has been sufficient for it to carry out its functions. Again, this is modelled on the UK Environment Bill and will enable us in Parliament to review whether ministers have fulfilled their obligation to provide sufficient funding or not. I mean, members will be aware that these matters can sometimes be a bit delicate, particularly as the constraints on public finances are likely to continue for the next few years. So my amendment requires the watchdog to raise any concerns it may have about funding simply as a matter of course and to do so transparently. and it can ensure that members of Parliament are aware of any financial constraints on its ability to be a robust body. Thanks.
Thank you. And can I call on Claudia Beamish to speak to these amendments?
Thank you, Convener, and I speak in support of both the amendments by Mark Ruskell in this group. I think that they are very important and very targeted, and I think the reason that I'm determined and hopeful that they will go through is because in straitened times for public finance, I wouldn't ever want there to be a situation where the new watchdog body was in any way struggling to do the robust work that could be needed as we go forward, whatever the complexion of a future government. So I'm very supportive. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. Amendments 1067 and 1068 from Mark Ruskell would place more structure around the funding arrangements for Environmental Standards Scotland, requiring Scottish ministers to pay to ESS such sums as ministers consider are reasonably sufficient to enable it to carry out its functions. And in addition, the annual reports of ESS would contain an assessment by Environmental Standards Scotland of whether in the financial year to which the report relates, the Scottish ministers provided it with sufficient sums to carry out its functions. I'm satisfied that the intention of these amendments is proportionate and that it would be helpful to provide structure around the funding of ESS. However, there's a technical concern that the provisions of the amendments clash with the process of resource allocation through the budget bill. There's no need to make special provision for ministers to pay monies to ESS, as it will be part of the Scottish administration. In addition, we don't want to inadvertently bypass the normal parliamentary scrutiny of spending. Therefore, I would ask Mark Ruskell to withdraw Amendment 1067 and not to move Amendment 1068, and I will offer to work with him on revised amendments for Stage 3 that take the spirit of the adequacy of funding on board without stepping on general budgetary rules. If pressed, however, I would have to ask the committee to oppose these amendments on the basis that, as currently drafted, they're not consistent with the budgetary process.
Thank you. And I call on Mark Ruskell to wind up and to press or withdraw Amendment 1067. Mark.
Can I thank Cabinet Secretary and Claudia for those comments? And I think on the back of that, I won't be pressing the amendment. I look forward to conversations we can have in the run-up to Stage 3 to get something which fits, as the Cabinet Secretary says, with the budget process that we have. I mean, you know, the budget process is a shared responsibility between government and Parliament, as we've seen in recent years. So, you know, I think transparency in this regard is really important. If there's a better way to crack this, a more elegant amendment, then I'm happy to work on that with the Cabinet Secretary ahead of Stage 3. Thanks.
Thank you. I call on, sorry, so you've withdrawn that amendment?
Yes, please, Convener.
Yep. Is the committee content for that amendment to be withdrawn? We are. Thank you. Right, I call Amendment 1040 in the name of Mark Ruskell, grouped with the amendments as shown in the groupings. Mark Ruskell, calling you to move Amendment 1040 and speak to all amendments in the group. Mark.
Thank you. I just turn to my notes on this. Thank you. So Amendment 1015 seeks to explicitly state that ESS, as well as monitoring and having regards to the developments of international EU law, should also monitor the use of the Section 1 keeping pace powers, and as it considers appropriate, make recommendations on the use or non-use of the powers. While this may be implicit in the general functions set out in Section 16.1, I think it is helpful to have it specifically stated in 16.2. This ensures that ESS has a role in ensuring ongoing continuity is maintained between Scotland and the EU in relation to environmental matters. My amendment 1013 is a pair with Claudia Beamish's amendment 1012 to remove the exclusion on climate change targets being included in ESS's remit. Now, I think I now understand the thinking in the bill behind allowing ESS to have a role in relation to climate adaptation, because there is, of course, a natural overlap between flood management, for example, and adaptation plans. But it can't be ignored that plans for climate mitigation also overlap with the wider environment, peatland restoration and air quality being two particular examples. And I think that this bill is in danger of creating a rough edge between mitigation and adaptation when it comes to the role of the environment of Scotland in delivering both aspects of our climate emergency response. ESS's role is statutory, while the UK Climate Change Committee role is advisory. However, I do accept that there is a need for clarity here between the bodies, and it would not be necessary for ESS to be advising on the relative contribution of different sectors to a net zero target, for example. That's why I've included under Amendment 1042 the need for a more detailed reporting framework than currently exists in the bill, and for that to also cover how ESS is avoiding overlap in its functions with the UK Climate Change Committee and other bodies. The regulations would require reporting on public authorities' compliance with environmental law, the effectiveness of that law and recommendations for future changes, with no restrictions placed on ESS for the frequency of these reports, which I think will be essential in supporting our successor committee's work in scrutinising ESS. Now, I recognise that in drafting 1040, that it does actually conflict with amendments in the previous grouping on funding reporting. So I will not move that amendment and perhaps wrap this, if the Cabinet Secretary is willing, into discussions at stage 3 on the financial reporting. And hopefully that could be dealt with more appropriately at stage 3 if the Cabinet Secretary is so willing. Thanks.
Thank you. I call on Angus MacDonald to speak to Amendment 1020 and other amendments in this group. Angus.
Okay, thank you, Convener. This amendment seeks to address concerns that if Section 39(3) is interpreted narrowly, it could prevent ESS exercising its various functions in circumstances where Scottish ministers have failed either at all or sufficiently to transpose an international obligation to domestic law. This is because this section defines environmental law, the phrase used in all the previous sections setting out ESS functions and powers. At present, 39(3) refers only to domestic law. This amendment adds relevant international law and thus removes the potential limitation on ESS's role. However, if it can be clarified that any other enactment in paragraph B includes international obligations, I would be content, I think, to withdraw or not press this amendment.
Thank you, and call on Claudia Beamish to speak to Amendment 1012 and other amendments in this group.
Thank you, Convener. The climate emergency is one of the greatest issues of our time, and my amendment 1012, for which I'm grateful to Mark Ruskell for his support, seeks to remove change targets from the remit of the ESS. During our stage 1 evidence, we heard comments from stakeholders that this was, I quote, an extremely odd exclusion, unquote, particularly as there is no such exclusion on the OEP for England. The Cabinet Secretary has stated that there is no need for, I quote, an additional institutional voice, unquote, in the process that is currently in place in receiving advice from the CCC. However, I would make the point as strongly as I can that the CCC performs an advisory role only, as much respect as I have for it. It is the ESS where the enforcement power lies to take any action on failure to comply or misapplication of environmental law as it relates to climate change. Finally, this continues to provide continuity with ESS arrangements and those of the European, includes climate change in its remit. I state my support for Mark Ruskell's amendment 1013, which I formally supported, which furthers this important change to the ESS's remit, and I hope the committee will consider our amendments favourably. In terms of Angus MacDonald's amendment, I will listen carefully to what the Cabinet Secretary has to say on that, and I'm supportive in principle, but will defer to Angus MacDonald as to whether it's necessary or not. Thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you. Colin, Cabinet Secretary, to speak to Amendment 1047 and the other amendments in this group. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. I'm first going to address Mark Ruskell's amendments 1040 and 1042. These amendments would remove the current flexible annual reporting provision in Schedule 1 and replace it with an onerous reporting requirement in a new section. Under Mark Ruskell's proposals, ESS would have to report at least annually on public authorities' compliance with environmental law, the effectiveness of environmental law, and any recommendations it had for Scottish ministers to bring forward proposals for legislation. This would necessitate ESS taking a view of compliance across the broad scope of environmental law and public authorities. And this is impractical. It's not how governance functioned in the EU system. The Commission were always keen to see that new laws were effectively transposed. However, there was no regular overall assessment of compliance with the law. Rather, the system worked by exception, by tackling instances of non-compliance, and this, frankly, is where resources should be targeted. This proposal is analogous to expecting the police to write an annual report on the lawfulness of the population, rather than using their resources to pursue and thereby deter crimes. So I do invite Mr Ruskell not to press these amendments, and if they are pressed, I would ask members not to support them. If I could now turn to amendments concerned with how ESS's functions can reflect on international obligations. There was some discussion of this at stage 1 and some concern that there was not sufficient provision for ESS to clearly address how well we are meeting our international commitments in all instances. We have amendments for 3 different approaches to this issue. Members will not be surprised to hear that I think that the government amendments are the best approach. By Amendment 1020, Angus MacDonald would expand the definition of environmental law, which is central to the functions of ESS, to include international obligations of the UK. This would mean that SEPA and ministers could be judged against any international obligation, regardless of whether it had been brought into Scots law by domestic legislation. I don't think this is the way to approach this issue. It perhaps wasn't quite what Angus MacDonald was intending, and I would invite him therefore not to press his amendment. Mark Ruskell's Amendment 1015 seeks to give ESS a new function of advising on the use of the power at Section 1.1 of the bill, but the power at Section 1.1 is about enabling us to align in future with EU standards rather than international obligations of the UK. There is some confusion here, and I would invite Mark Ruskell not to press his amendment. The Government Amendments 1047 and 1048 will ensure that ESS functions relating to the effectiveness of environmental law will include consideration of its contribution to the implementation of any international obligation of the United Kingdom relating to environmental protection. And this will allow consideration of the effectiveness of law in meeting our commitments under agreements like the Ramsar Convention in a proportionate manner. I recommend that members support these amendments 1047 and 1048. Turning to amendments 1012 and 1013, which seek to remove the exemption of climate change planning, I think that it is important to clarify what is actually being excluded from the scope of ESS functions by the provisions as introduced, as I think there is some misunderstanding. The exclusion is of the consideration, construction and enforcement of duties in relation to the setting of cross-economy greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets and the preparation of strategic cross-portfolio climate change plans to meet these. Specific measures within environmental law to deliver emissions reductions would be within scope, as are strategic planning duties in relation to climate change adaptation. To bring cross-economy emissions targets and strategic planning into the scope of ESS would be to duplicate the current strong arrangements for oversight, advice and enforcement with something less effective. ESS will not have the capacity to match the advisory expertise already provided by the UK Committee for Climate Change, nor will it be able to match the strength of the oversight for the setting and subsequent achievement of targets that is provided by the Parliament itself. It would be wasteful for ESS to expend resources on these functions, given that any interventions seem likely at best to slow the processes and confuse lines of accountability. And the amendment does give rise to a number of questions. For example, if ESS were given the role of oversight on government's achievements of climate change targets, what in fact would that mean in practice? Would ESS need additional resource and capacity? Would it take time to consider any failure? Would they, if necessary, write an improvement report in this regard? If so, it's not clear where this advice would be drawn from, other than existing expertise of the Committee for Climate Change. Would all of this add to the rigour of the system or simply lead to duplication and delay? That notwithstanding, I am aware that there is a confusing comparison to be had with the equivalent position in the UK Environment Bill. As I understand the current position following government amendments, the UK Office for Environmental Protection will have no advisory role with respect to climate change emissions planning, but will have a role in enforcement. And I am prepared to explore that further so we can get a better understanding of the difference. And I would ask Claudia Beamish and Mark Ruskell not to press amendments 1012 and 1013, and if they are pressed, would invite the committee to reject them.
Thank you. I invite Mark Ruskell to wind up and to draw amendment 1040. Mark.
Yeah, thanks, convener. And yes, I will be withdrawing amendment number 1040. There's a lot to sort of pick up on there, and I'm sure that we can pick up on a more substantive discussion with the Cabinet Secretary, myself and Claudia Beamish between now and stage 3. But just on the sort of broader point around reporting, there is a reporting framework in the bill. I think we've already acknowledged that in relation to finance, it isn't quite robust enough. The Cabinet Secretary says that should be based on exceptions rather than reporting general compliance in relation to environmental law. But I think within the framework I've put forward, it is at the discretion of ESS, as of course a fully independent body, not a commission, but a fully independent body, to report on what it sees as appropriate to the Parliament to consider. And that may well be changes in the law that it thinks are needed. It may well be reports around, the level of compliance in certain sectors that it wishes to draw our attention to. So that, the whole point of having an independent body is enabling it to be able to determine that. But for there to be a robust reporting, perhaps there's more discussion we could have about that between now and stage 3. In terms of the issue around climate, I think there's some mixed messages here. In relation to adaptation, which clearly is cross-portfolio and is strategic in its nature, ESS does have a role. I'm at a loss to understand why it doesn't then have a role in relation to aspects of mitigation that are directly related to the environment, such as peatland restoration, which is a very large and important action and topic that the Scottish Government is committed to over many years. Clearly, again, there's perhaps more discussion that we could have here ahead of stage 3, and I'd look forward to that, and whether something that's more appropriate in terms of pinning exactly what ESS's role is in relation to adaptation, enforcement, and mitigation will be, because at the moment it's not clear. And my sense with the evidence that we took from Chris Stark at the UK Climate Change Committee is that it's not really clear to them either. I'll leave it there. Thanks, convener.
Thank you. So you've indicated that you want to withdraw amendment 1040. Can I ask the other members of the committee if they're content for this to be withdrawn? They are content, and I'll go through the other amendments one by one. Okay, I call amendment 1068 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with amendment 1067, and ask Mark Ruskell if he wishes to move or not move.
Not moved.
Thank you. Call amendment 101034 and ask Mark Ruskell if he wishes to move or not move that amendment.
Sorry, Convener, I didn't quite hear that number.
1041.
Not moved.
Thank you. Right, the question then is that Schedule 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Just waiting for an indication from Mark. We are agreed. We are agreed. Right, I call Amendment 1015 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with Amendment 1040, and ask Mark Ruskell if he wishes to move or not move that amendment.
Could I not move 1015 and can also not move 1042, please, Convener?
Thank you. Yeah. Question is that Section 16 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yep, we are all agreed. The question is that sections 17 and 18 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Call Amendment 1062 in the name of Angus MacDonald, grouped with Amendment 1063. I ask Angus MacDonald to move Amendment 102 amendments in the group.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Members will recall that in the committee's Stage 1 report, we concluded that an amendment should be brought forward to add to the list of persons in relation to whom ESS must set out how it will avoid overlap in functions in its strategy. I understand that the Scottish Government remains of the view that this is not a necessary step, as Schedule 2 currently allows for the strategy to set out that detail. However, I feel it is worth pursuing. So I'm therefore grateful for the support that the Scottish Government has provided in bringing forward these amendments to ensure that if an amendment is made to add to the list of persons in paragraph 11D2 of Schedule 2, it is done in a way that is effective. So in closing briefly, Convener, these amendments will ensure that ESS must set out in its strategy how it will exercise its functions in a way that respects and avoids any overlap with the exercise of functions by the Scottish Information Commissioner, Audit Scotland and the Committee on Climate Change. But happy
to move. Okay. I think we heard that. Yes, we did.
Yeah.
Okay, I call on the Cabinet Secretary. Oh,
thank
sorry.
you, Convener. I think I can be brief.
Cabinet Secretary, I've just realised that two other members wish to speak in this.
Okay.
Members, can I ask you to be a little bit quicker with the chat box when the initial movers speaking would be helpful. I nearly missed that there. So apologies to the Cabinet Secretary, and I call Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener, and apologies. I was waiting to hear what Angus MacDonald had said before I indicated I wanted to speak, but I take your point completely. In the circumstances where I'm considering not taking forward my climate change amendment 1012 at this stage, at stage 2, and looking government with the Cabinet Secretary to how to look at this in relation to enforcement powers of the ESS, I would ask Angus MacDonald, with respect, to consider not moving the amendment he's just spoken to, 1062, because I think it has implications in relation to that other amendment. But, you know, it of course is entirely up to him. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. And Mark Ruskell wishes to speak on this amendment. Mark.
Yeah, thanks. Very similar point. I'm supportive of what Angus is attempting to do here, but I think it's very difficult to consider that issue of overlap with UK Climate Change Committee when it's still not really clear what ESS's role is going to be in relation to climate. So I would just ask Angus maybe not to move it just now, if he wants my support, that is.
Thank you. And now to the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. Necessary, and ESS would already have the flexibility to set out material on relationships with other persons in its strategy. However, I am nevertheless happy to support these amendments, which would additionally require ESS to set out in its strategy how it will exercise its functions so as to respect and avoid any overlap with the functions of the Scottish Information Commissioner, Audit Scotland and the Committee on Climate Change. I'm not sure that this in any way really contradicts anything from the previous discussion, and I therefore invite the committee to support these amendments.
Thank you. And I call on Angus MacDonald to wind up and to press and withdraw Amendment 1062. Angus.
Okay, thanks, Convener. As someone who's normally in favour of consensus, I'm afraid on this occasion I'm going to move these amendments. Having duly taken on board what Mark Ruskell and Claudia Beamish have said, I think it's still important that we try to get these through. Thank you. So
Thank you. The question pressing them. Okay. The question is 062 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Okay, we're not agreed, therefore I will do a roll call. Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener. Which we're at.
Sorry, Claudia, you did cut out slightly there. Could you say that again, please?
I'm against at this stage, Convener.
Yes. Finlay Carson.
For.
Angus MacDonald.
For.
Gillian Martin is for. Mark Ruskell.
Against.
Liz Smith.
For.
Stuart Stevenson.
For.
Thank you. We just collate the results of that vote. Okay, the result of the vote on Amendment 1062, total votes for 5, total votes against 2. The amendment is therefore agreed to. Call Amendment 1063 in the name of Angus MacDonald, already debated with Amendment 1062, and ask Angus MacDonald if he wishes to move or not move the amendment.
Move, Convener.
The question then is that Amendment 1063 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. Okay. Claudia Beamish.
Abstain, Convener.
Finlay Carson.
For.
Finlay Carson.
For.
I'm not sure if you called me Convener, but I'm for.
Angus.
For.
Thank you. Gillian Martin is for. Mark Ruskell.
Abstain.
Liz Smith.
For.
And Stuart Stevenson.
For.
Okay, just collect those results. The results of the vote on Amendment 1063. Total votes for 5, total votes against 0, total abstentions 2. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The question is that Schedule 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The question is that sections 19, 20, 21 and 22 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. Call Amendment 1018 in the name of Angus MacDonald grouped with Amendment 1019. I invite Angus MacDonald to move Amendment 1018 and speak to both amendments in this group. Angus.
Okay, thanks, Convener. The purpose and reasoning behind Amendments 1018 and 1019 are to help ensure ESS provides continuity with existing arrangements under the EU and upholds the rights of people in Scotland to see action taken in response to environmental complaints they raise about decisions that have been taken by public bodies. Effectively, they remove the subsections in sections 23 and 28 that restrict ESS's powers in relation to individual cases. You'll recall, members will recall that this committee's report at stage 1 in paragraphs 141 to 146 raised concerns about these subsections, concluding that, and I quote, restricting the remit of the ESS to strategic issues in relation to improvement and compliance reports could be unduly restrictive and have unintended consequences. So I think it's worth pointing out that within the EU, the ability of stakeholders to raise concerns about individual cases with the European Commission has been crucial. Many such cases have proven to be strategic and precedent-setting, so there's an argument that restricting ESS's powers in this way means that we would not be replicating the functions of the Commission. Now, I'm aware of and understand the Government's concerns that without this restriction, ESS would become an additional layer of appeal for all decisions, or that it would invite such a flurry of complaints that ESS would be overwhelmed and would need resources to address that avalanche. Indeed, it's been suggested to me since lodging this amendment that it could cause chaos in that it would fundamentally alter the nature of the powers given to ESS, allowing it to overturn individual regulatory and planning decisions and would cut across established regulatory appeals processes that already exist. So, Convener, I would be keen to hear the Cabinet Secretary's view before deciding how I wish to proceed, but I have to say I'm in a genuine quandary over this. Like others on the committee, I've had concerns about the restriction of ESS powers to act in individual cases. I've read the Cabinet Secretary's response on this, and I appreciate that there will be no restriction on ESS considering information about individual cases, only in taking enforcement action in individual cases. In addition, I also understand that there are concerns in local authorities and amongst the regulators about the impact on regulatory structures and processes if ESS could review and overturn individual regulatory decisions. So, as I say, I'm in a real quandary on this one. I'd be keen to hear the Cabinet Secretary's views and will decide whether to move or withdraw once I've heard these views and comments from other members.
Thank you. And Claudia Beamish wishes to speak on this amendment. Claudia.
Thank you very much, Convener. And I'm in principle very supportive of Angus MacDonald's amendment on individual cases, and he's said it extremely clearly that in EU, much of what has happened in terms of the development of law and its enforcement has come from individual cases, which has protected our environment robustly. And a lot of this could not have happened without these. I am somewhat concerned about the capacity issue for the ES becomes a full body going into the future. And I wonder if it might be possible to have some clarity, possibly before stage 3, as to how that could be perhaps shaped in more detail on the face of the bill, or there could be a commitment to regulation. But I am very supportive in principle and hope that, if not now, then at least at stage 3, that I'll be in a position to support this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, and call the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. These amendments would fundamentally alter the nature of the powers given to Environmental Standards Scotland. If ESS were given powers to overturn individual regulatory and planning decisions, it would result in significant regulatory uncertainty and disruption. Such uncertainty could have significant economic costs and particularly severe impacts on the development planning system in particular, and place untenable demands on ESS. Effectively, we would be turning the ESS into a kind of super regulator. It should not be used as a means to review individual decisions or as some kind of substitute appeal process. Once all existing mechanisms of challenge have been exhausted, individual regulatory decisions should be deemed final. And this is particularly the case in the current time of significant disruption and uncertainty to all organisations as a result of both Brexit and the pandemic. Moreover, the integrity of existing statutory regimes that make provision for the appeal or review of such decisions must be preserved. Local authorities, regulators and regulated business representatives have already expressed significant concerns regarding the potential impacts if ESS were given these powers. It is the case that individuals and organisations will be able to submit concerns regarding individual decisions to ESS, and ESS will be able to investigate these matters and consider whether these decisions demonstrate failures in regulatory practice or the effectiveness of environmental law. While the European Commission did on occasion investigate individual matters or decisions, the Commission's primary focus has been on decisions of a strategic nature, and this is the role which ESS is intended to fulfil. So I therefore invite Angus MacDonald not to press his amendments, but if he does, I would urge the committee to reject them.
Thank you, and I now come to Angus MacDonald to wind up and to either move or withdraw his amendment 1018.
Okay, thanks, Convener. In light of the Cabinet Secretary's explanation, I now wish to withdraw the amendments, as I can now see the difficulties that they would cause, particularly given the precedent it would set on planning issues, which the Cabinet Secretary gave as an example. And I welcome the assurances that ESS will still be able to investigate individual cases. So I'm withdrawing both amendments, 1018 and 1019.
Thank you. Is the committee content for those amendments to be withdrawn? Yes, they are. Thank you. Section 23 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. Thank you. The question is that sections 24, 25, 26 and 27 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. Thank you. And just confirm that amendment 1019 in the name of Angus MacDonald was withdrawn and that the committee consented to that withdrawal. The question is that section 28 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. And the question is that sections 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34 and 35 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. Call Amendment 1043 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with Amendments 1044 and 1045. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 1043 and speak to all the amendments in this group. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. These amendments seek to amend Section 36 of the Bill to provide a simpler confidentiality provision and remove the restriction on the disclosure of information by third parties. These amendments have been lodged in response to concerns submitted by the Scottish Information Commissioner in relation to interactions with the Environmental Information Regulations and Freedom of Information Scotland Act. Amendment 1043 adjusts Section 36(2)(d) to clarify that the rule against disclosure of information by the ESS under Section 36(1) does not apply to a disclosure where an improvement report has been published or compliance notice issued and the time limits for an appeal have expired or the appeal process concluded, as well as in instances where ESS has determined that it does not wish to take any further action. Amendment 1044 adds further exemptions to the rule against disclosure by ESS where disclosure relates to civil proceedings, the investigation or prosecution of an offence or suspected offence, the detection of crime, an order of a court or tribunal, or is made in accordance with an enactment requiring or permitting the disclosure. Amendment 1045 would remove the imposition of confidentiality duties on public authorities currently imposed by subsections 3 to 6. This amendment would also remove the specific reference to environmental information for the purposes of the Environmental Information Scotland Regulations 2004 contained in section 36(7), as this is not required. The amendments address the concerns of the Scottish Information Commissioner whilst allowing Environmental Standards Scotland to carry out its functions effectively. Issues regarding confidentiality and disclosure of information will be addressed in the strategy to be prepared by Environmental Standards Scotland. This strategy will be subject to public consultation and will be laid before and approved by Parliament. I move Amendment 1043.
Thank you, and I'm not seeing any members wishing to speak on that amendment, so the question is that Amendment 1043 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Call Amendment 1044 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1043, and ask the Cabinet Secretary to move that formally.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 1044 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. Call Amendment 1045 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1043. Ask the Cabinet Secretary to move it formally.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 1045 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. The question then is that Section 36 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. Thank you. Right, I call Amendment 1046 in the name of Liz Smith in a group on its own, and I call Liz Smith to move and speak to Amendment 1046.
Thank you, Convener. Can I move Amendment 1046? The reason behind this amendment is because of the likely gaps in governance which will occur when the transition period ends. Because obviously the loss of the access to the EU Court of Justice presents issues in this respect, most especially when individual environmental cases are examined for any breaches of the law. I fully appreciate that the newly established Environmental Standards Scotland and the judicial review process will address many concerns, but on the basis of current practice within environmental matters in Scotland, there are examples when access to a court process is an important fallback, especially if existing environmental agencies are unable to resolve a major concern. So this amendment requires Scottish ministers to bring forward and consult on the need to ensure that all gaps in governance left by our inability to access the EU Court of Justice are fully addressed. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, and I'm not seeing any other members wishing to speak on this amendment. I call the Cabinet Secretary.
Convener, this amendment seeks to introduce an additional reporting requirement within the first year of operation of ESS when ESS will not have had sufficient opportunity to become fully established and effective. We have to bear in mind that the provisions in the bill give ESS a year from statutory establishment to prepare and lay a strategy before the Parliament for approval. And this strategy will set out the detail on how it will exercise its functions, including how it will provide for people to make representations to it about any matter concerning public authorities' compliance with environmental law, or concerning the effectiveness of that law or of how it is applied. The provisions include procedures for consultation and parliamentary approval of the strategy. It doesn't make sense to run the process of reviewing governance arrangements put in place under the bill and other matters at the same time as the Parliament is considering and commenting on the strategy of ESS as to how it intends to exercise its functions. Can I say I'm grateful for discussion with Liz Smith on her amendment. If the amendment were to be modified to provide a longer timescale for the preparation and publication of the proposals relating to environmental governance and environmental law, these proposals may support ongoing scrutiny of our approach to environmental protection and access to justice following our departure from Europe. This would allow ESS to become fully established and operational, and for its strategy to have been consulted on and scrutinised and approved by Parliament. Questions surrounding the potential for the creation of a dedicated environmental court are much broader than the focus and purpose of this bill. In 2017, I committed to keeping these issues under consideration, and the successor committee will no doubt wish to explore these issues over the coming years. I'm therefore willing to work with Liz Smith and with my ministerial colleagues with responsibility for justice matters with a view to developing an appropriate amendment for consideration at stage 3. So with that offer, I am asking Liz Smith not to press her amendment today. If the amendment is pressed, I would ask the committee not to support it on the basis of the undertaking I've made to work with Liz Smith with a view to bringing forward an adjusted amendment or amendments at stage 3.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I appear to have had some connection problems. I'd just like to check with my colleagues whether everyone else heard your full statement there. And everyone did, so it was just me. Okay. Thank you. I'd like to call on Liz Smith to wind up and to press to withdraw Amendment 1046. Liz.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you to the Cabinet Secretary for her engagement and also for the comments that she has just stated. I do understand that there are a few technical issues about this, and particularly in light of what the Cabinet Secretary says about the timescale. I do, however, think that there are important principles behind this, so I very much welcome her commitment to engage further before stage 3. So on that basis, I'm happy to seek to withdraw the amendment, not to press it just now.
Yeah, I'll just check with other members of the committee. Happy for this amendment to be withdrawn, 1046? Yes, they are. The question is then that sections 37 and 38 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Call Amendment 1020 in the name of Angus MacDonald, already debated with Amendment 1040, and ask Angus MacDonald to move or not move this amendment. Just ask broadcasting to unmute the microphone.
Yeah, that's it. Not moved.
Thank you. Call Amendment 1012 in the name of Claudia Beamish, already debated with Amendment 1040, and ask Claudia Beamish if she wishes to move or not move this amendment.
Not move, and look forward to discussions with the Cabinet Secretary. Thank you.
Thank you. Call Amendment 1013 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with Amendment 1040, and ask Mark Ruskell if he wishes to move or not move this amendment.
Not moved.
Thank you. I call Amendment 1047 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1040, and ask the Cabinet Secretary to move that formally.
Moved.
Question is that Amendment 1047 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Call Amendment 1048 in the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1040. Ask the Cabinet Secretary to move that formally.
Moved.
Question is that Amendment 1048 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The question is that Section 38 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Sorry, I'll say that again. The question is that Section 39 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. Call Amendment 1014 in the name of Claudia Beamish, already debated with Amendment 1031. Ask Claudia Beamish to move or not move the amendment.
Not moved, convener.
Thank you. Call Amendment 1049 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1031. Ask the Cabinet Secretary to move it formally.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 1049 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Call Amendment 1050 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1031. Ask the Cabinet Secretary to move it formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 1050 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. Call Amendment 1051 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 1031. Ask the Cabinet Secretary to move it formally.
Moved.
Question is that Amendment 1051 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The question is that Section 40 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Question is that Section 41 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Call Amendment 1052 in the name of Mark Ruskell, already debated with Amendment 1022, and ask Mark Ruskell to move or not move. Not moved.
Thank you.
Thank you. Call Amendment 1009 in the name of Liam MacArthur, already debated. Now, Liam MacArthur is not with us. It was that's the one that he actually withdrew that. Okay, I'll just check that the committee's content for that Amendment 1009 not to be withdrawn. Everyone's agreed. Thank you. Call Amendment 1064 in the name of Stuart Stevenson, already debated with Amendment 1022, and ask Stuart Stevenson to move or not move the amendment.
I move Amendment 1064.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 1064 be agreed to. Are we all agreed to? Are we all agreed? We are agreed. The question is that the long title be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. And that ends Stage 2 consideration of the bill. Thank you to everyone. That concludes the committee's business today. The next meeting of the committee will take place on the 1st of December. At that meeting, we will hear from the Minister for Rural Affairs and the Natural Environment, As part of the committee's regional marine planning inquiry, we'll also be considering EU exit legislation at that meeting. Thank you, everyone. That concludes our meeting today.